Hello and welcome to Threat Hunting Demystified. If you're joining us live, our speaker is in the Slido chat discussion answering your questions right now. For audio-video issues, click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Ashish Thapar for the presentation.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining this session today at the RSA Conference 2020 Asia Pacific in Japan. My name is Ashish Thapar, and I'm going to talk to you today about threat hunting. As almost all of you would appreciate, the cybersecurity landscape is in a constant state of change, and as many organizations have learned, it's no longer a matter of whether an organization will face a cyber attack, but when. Attackers are increasingly trying to hide behind the typical noise in an enterprise IT, IoT, or OT environment in order to evade automated defenses. With the rise of zero-day and multi-stage attacks, it's harder than ever to protect data and systems with confidence. In this session, I would like to highlight the importance of threat hunting to raise the bar from a cyber defender's perspective, starting from its very meaning, its benefits, and the best practice approach for its effective implementation in an organization. So, in terms of my role as the head of Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center for Asia Pacific and Japan region, my team helps customers on emergency investigations and peacetime capability development initiatives or assessments with respect to incident response. We also help produce data breach investigations reports, something that Verizon has been doing for the last 13 years with its latest edition in collaboration with 81 contributors. And when we try to use this data breach investigation report to understand the threat landscape, few interesting insights emerge. Social action, credential, and errors are seen as the main threat actions in about 67% of the data breaches. As you can see on the chart here, errors have gone up in the last few years, and phishing and use of stolen credentials as threat actions have more or less held their position. The impact of chip and PIN technology is showing up as RAM scrapers, are not the tool of choice by the financially motivated attackers making money out of stolen cardholder data. Password dumpers are number one in the malware category. Now, with that kind of high-level overview of the threat actions, let's try to look at the threat actors and actions a bit more on my next slide. So, talking about the threat actors, majority of these threat actors belong to organized crime syndicates. That's more than 55%. About 10% are nation-state or state-affiliated. A similar percentage is from the insider threats, whether system admins or end users. And there are some lone wolves as well who are not yet part of a syndicate. In terms of the motivation, the threat actors have mainly financial motives, about 85% behind the attacks. Smaller percentage towards the espionage comes on the back of state-sponsored or industrial espionage. Top threat actions, if I talk about top threat action varieties, we are talking about things like social engineering, mainly phishing, pretexting, or business email compromise. I'm sure everybody knows phishing. Pretexting is a form of social engineering where attackers focus on creating a good pretext or a fabricated scenario that they use to try and steal victims' personal information. And business email compromise is also known as, sometimes CFO fraud, mainly uses an email hijack scenario to trick the paying entity into making a wire transfer to an attacker-controlled bank account. Errors, misdelivery, misconfiguration is going high, as I mentioned on my last slide. Reporting rates have gone up. I think that's one of the main reasons. The other reason is a hushed-up movement to the cloud environment. That's another reason. In fact, in this year, in the work-from-home scenario, we do expect that such errors possibly would emerge even more in terms of the threat actions. About 21%, I would say, if you talk about the errors, in one of the 5 breaches, it's caused by errors, which represents a doubling as compared to the last year data set. So moving on to the threat actions and getting a little bit deeper dive on hacking and malware. In terms of hacking, let me just give you a quick definition. It's defined as a scenario where it is the attacker's infrastructure being used to carry out the attack, like fingers on the keyboard kind of scenarios, right? Utilizing manual or automated techniques. 90% of the breaches, they involve web application attacks in terms of hacking as an action. And different varieties are like, use of stolen credentials, vulnerability exploitation, and use of backdoor or C2, command and control. looking at malware, we are looking at malware, which is obviously defined as a scenario where victim infrastructure is being used to run the unauthorized code or binary. And some of the interesting insights there are about 40% of the malware belongs to password dumper category. Ransomware accounts for about 27% of the total malware data set. So ransomware is going up, as you saw also on the previous slide. And malware, this is an interesting one, right? When we do investigations, we do see that malware is now starting to be seen only once. So not before, not after, in about 40% of the cases, which pretty much tells that these malware are increasingly being unique or targeted. Now that we have seen the type of threat actors, their motivation, the main threat actions they do, let us look at the victim side of the story, right? So when we look at the victim side of the story, obviously it's about we have a very, very busy environment, noisy environment. If you take an example of a typical medium-sized organization, and I'm just putting some numbers to put spotlight on the scale of the problem we need to manage, I've depicted some numbers on events per second on some of the commonly seen systems in an organization, very noisy systems like firewall, to the less noisy systems like routers, or a domain controller, which can also be very chatty. Right? We are easily talking about 1,000 events per second. In essence, about 3.6 million events per day. Now, many auditors may come to you and they would ask you to switch on every type of log in your operating system, platform, database, but all these logs add up. If I can give you an example, when you take a picture from your camera, you need to maintain a fine balance between adequate lighting and overexposure, right? So how do you find signals from the noise, right? It becomes a very serious problem. And how do you manage the blind spots in your in the asset inventory, right? That's another problem. Shadow IT is another very complex situation where business teams may come up with their own IT infrastructure without even any slightest of knowledge to the IT team. Asset management becomes very critical, right? It may sound boring, but I can tell you it's main foundation of any sound threat or risk management strategy. Insider threats are very difficult to detect, of course, right? And if you talk about things like third parties, they obviously come in various shapes and forms, on-site, off-site, on-site contractors, P2P links, extended networks, VPNs. We're talking about a large gamut of variables here. Cloud syndrome. We talk about the one of my favorites, of course, and something that organizations think that it's cool and comfy under the cloud. But this perception leads to some horror stories. You need to really protect your data yourself. Responsibilities and roles are very important. Build controls as usual. Don't think that cloud gives you that cover by default. Follow defense in depth strategy and implement a data-centric security model. Right? Things about zero-day vulnerabilities, very scary, of course. Enough challenge there, adding fuel to the fire, I would say. Indicators of compromise, obviously having a short shelf life. Right. So in essence, what we are talking about is finding this evil or bad Nemo, if I can take an example, is definitely a big problem. It must be a problem that first needs to be acknowledged so that we can really solve it pragmatically. Now, let's look at the other dimension in terms of one of the takeaways from Verizon's data breach investigation report in giving the insight of the detection gap. Now, if you see on the charts, you see the time to compromise versus time to discover, right? You see the trend line in the numbers that we are seeing. Definitely, some of the things that we observe is that more than half of the breaches are discovered by external security researchers, and discovery in months or more still accounts for over a quarter of breaches, right? And that's why I would say that when you look at the detection gap. And how you want to shorten this gap, I think the key thing that emerges is effective and efficient threat hunting can help shorten this gap. I would say effective and efficient, these are two very important keywords, right? So till now, we looked at the threat landscape. We talked about the threat actors. We also saw the threat actions they carry out. We also looked at the noise problem. I'm sure we all appreciate that finding a needle in the haystack is not easy. That too, when the needle does not look like a needle, right? And that's why I would say that an assumed breach principle, kind of keeps you on the toes, elevates your state of readiness against a cyber adversary. This means that despite all protection in place, you would assume that system will fail, people will make errors, and adversary may penetrate the infrastructure or your systems. Now, this posture places an organization in an on-standby mode to rapidly detect a compromise and take appropriate actions. Now, that's why threat hunting becomes very, very important. So let's kind of do a bit of deep dive into understanding what is threat hunting. So in terms of what is threat hunting, I would say that it's something which is hypothesis driven. It's a hypothesis driven exercise. It's something that where you do proactive and iterative searching for threats. It's a state where it helps you reduce the false negatives and shades of gray in terms of your detection. It assumes that adversaries are already present in the infrastructure. It lays a strong focus on the indicators of attacks. So not only focusing on indicators of compromise, but also indicators of attacks, and obviously helps you prioritize your threat management. It's also important to now understand that what it is not, right? Many times, threat hunting is used and abused as a term in the industry. So, there are some mythbusters that I have to share with you. It's not meant to replace preventive controls or signature-based detection controls. It is not a panacea, right? It is expensive, yes, I agree, but it's not expensive to the core where its benefits outweigh the costs. Because I think when you have a breach situation, the cost could really multiply exponentially high. And also, threat hunting is not only about shiny tools like user entity, behavioral analytics, network detection and response, endpoint detection and response, or even security orchestration, automation, and response kind of tools. Whereas these tools are useful, but it's not equal to just implementing these tools, because I strongly believe tools are garbage in, garbage out. If you don't configure them well, if you don't have a robust process around it, it doesn't really help. And also, this threat hunting really helps you reduce the time to, from a dwell time perspective, from a compromise to discovery. That's another way to look at the detection gap. It really helps you do that. But before we start doing threat hunting, I would strongly say that we must devise a model. So I'm going to share with you today, presenting a 5-phase model here. This can help organizations to manage a threat hunting program. I think before I get into this 5-phase model, it's important to know that certain basic fundamentals will always remain. You must know your ground, right? You must know your adversary. You must devise a repeatable approach, and that's why this model. This must be done on a recurring basis, so it should be iterative and not one time, right? The resourcing for threat hunting must be efficient, and the execution must be effective. Right. So with those fundamentals in mind, let's dive into all the 5 phases, quickly. So the first phase, baselining and objectives. We're talking about, establishing a program, right? That's something very important. You need to really have a program so that you can improve it, you can leverage it, and you need to obtain sponsorship, management sponsorship, whether it comes from a support or a financial sponsorship perspective. You really need to have those things in place, because otherwise, the program may fail after you go for certain miles. You must refer a framework, some respectable frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK framework, Cyber Kill Chain, or even Diamond model. There are multiple ways and means. One of my personal favorites is MITRE ATT&CK framework. You may have your own favorites. You must define maturity levels. You need to know where you are and where you want to go, right? Point A to point B kind of thing, right? You must get the right people with the right skills. And I would say even more important than right skills sometimes is the right attitude, because the folks really need to enjoy doing what they do for them to really not feel bored about. This is a very interesting, concept. This is a very interesting program. You need to have people with the right level of motivation and attitude to do these kind of things. And of course, you must clearly allocate roles and responsibilities so that, you don't drop the ball. It goes from one person to another or one team to another. So moving on to the next phase, we're talking about things like, basically setting your target. Setting your target means where will you hunt? What is the data that you would look at? How big is the sea to find the bad Nemo, right? The evil. So we are talking about finalizing your data sources in terms of your network, whether it is NetFlow, proxy, DNS, or firewall, or full packet capture logs. we're talking about endpoints of huge amount of information there as well. Logs, MACD, modified axis, change and birth. Those kind of timestamps, file timestamps are important. Memory artifacts. There are a lot of system artifacts, registry on Windows platform, for example, very, very useful in terms of visibility. Cloud-based platforms have their own nuances, different type of logs, also dashboards and alerting mechanisms, they can really be of good use. Threat intelligence is very, very important. It can help you move faster. It can help you leverage what is already known. So again, very important. Observables obviously come in different shapes and forms in terms of your domain names, your IOCs, different kind of indicators of compromise, IP addresses, registry entries, hash values, different things there. So net, I think the main important point is you must decrease the visibility gap. I think that's a very important point by collating as much of data, but useful amount of data. Don't collect noise. You must. That's why the earlier point was signals to noise ratio is very important. You must collect data which is useful. You must review the verbosity of logs. Again, back to the noise problem that you don't want too much noise in your logs, which is not useful. Restrict yourself to data which is useful. So you must, that's why, that whole repeatable and iterative process is important. You must collect this, enrich all that data, and normalize it. So make it in a form and shape which is analyzable in an easy manner, in an automated manner. And that's why you must leverage automation to make it faster, better, and effective every time you do it, right? So that's about the second phase. So basically setting your target in terms of where will you hunt? What is the data on which you will hunt? So moving on to phase 3, we're talking about the arsenal, right? This is all about sharpening your arrows, creating your infrastructure, your arsenal on which you will work on. So threat intelligence feeds are important. There are a lot of open source paid feeds available. You can look at that. There are a lot of lookup sources like ThreatCrowd, VirusTotal, PDNS, Whois, GeoIntel, domain tools, right? Shodan.io, Census.io, a whole amount of information is available, right? And of course, you also need to look at, different type of platforms, right? So SIEM or SOAR platforms, endpoint detection response. Don't forget the typical easy to implement Sysmon, right? It's easy, it's free. You can easily make use of it, very useful. Network detection response at the network telemetry level is, again, increasingly important. And, in terms of the antivirus, right? I can't stress enough, even the antivirus is a very important source of your information that you want to leverage, right, from your platform perspective, because even if a malware that got quarantined or deleted has a story to tell, right? So things like geolocation, like I mentioned, National Software Resource Library, again, become, in a laboratory in terms of the known good. That's important, right? And threat intel platforms, like I mentioned earlier, a few of those are critical. Understanding the TTPs of the threat actors, again, comes handy from, let's say, attack matrices that are available from MITRE. You must have a very robust log management platform or a data lake on which you will really work on, right? You need to have a consolidated data set. Like I said earlier, develop automation and visualization at this point, right? So you must use platforms like, SoftELK or things like HELK, H-E-L-K, the hunting elk. That's an open source platform specifically meant for threat hunting. Again, you can have a look at that to leverage in your threat hunting program. Let's move on to the next phase, talking about the execution. This is very important phase, right? Now that you have set your target on what data you will look at, where will you hunt, you've readied your arsenal, so to say, sharpened your arrows already. I think the main thing I would like to say is that start small in this phase. Focus on your crown jewels. That's very important, right? You can't have a big bang approach of looking at everything. You need to really restrict yourself to, let's say, the main important assets to start with. Form a hypothesis, right? This is very important. The 5W and the 1H approach. 5W as in what, where, why, when, who, right? And 1H as in how, right? You need to really have that hypothesis before you even execute a proper threat hunting exercise. And there are different hunting techniques, things like searching, clustering, grouping, frequency analysis. We also call it stacking sometimes, to understand and identify aberrations and anomalies, right? It's all about finding that unknown, right? And that's why these techniques become very, very important. you must be aware of the data or cognitive biases, right? You must know that, you don't have certain amount of data, or you have certain amount of data too much. You don't need to know your biases so you can take a calculated call there. You must decide your frequency, because you need to, like I said, it's an iterative process, so you need to kind of execute it on an ongoing basis. Can't stress enough, automation and visualization is important. It's a human initiated effort, but you need to automate it so you can do it faster, because it's time consuming. Right. So anything wherever you can automate, make some scripts, make some automation and make some visualization. Picture speaks 1,000 words, right? So it's important to kind of have that visualization component. I gave you the example of, SoftElk, or some of the commercial platforms are available. Health, like I mentioned, can give you some amount of visualization. And I think you must not, kind of depend on a one team strategy, right? You must leverage collaboration, bring in new perspectives, maybe just involve, other teams, right? SecOps team, red teaming kind of teams that do penetration testing and red teaming exercises, bring them also into the play to really look at, are you doing it better? What are the improvement areas that you can look at, and how can you really make it more effective and efficient? So in terms of the last phase, we are talking about improvising, right? This is where you really take stock of what all has happened, what all have you done, and how well have you done it, or what are the learnings, right? Refining the metrics is important. You must gauge your maturity level again. You must maintain statistics, because if you don't measure something, you can't improve it, and of course you can't maintain it, right? So you need to have some measurement there. You must identify those visibility gaps. Let's say you were doing a threat hunting execution and you found out, all right, if I had that particular component here, it would have made my life simpler and easier. Why not? Let's identify that, right? Remove those biases, and you must feed back to the baselining and objectives phase. So it's an iterative, it's a cyclic loop, right? And that's how I would say, I would summarize the 5-step, kind of hunting model, so to say. I call it the Fabulous 5, but just a reminder there, I am available on Slido. So if you have any questions or you have any feedback, please feel free to put it through Slido, and I will surely get to it, towards the end. Now let us quickly walk through a sample use case, right? Let us hunt for, let's say, for example, as a sample use case, hunt for C2 connections in your enterprise, right? Command and control connections. Follow the same 5-phase threat hunting model. We start with baselining and objectives, right? So we start with, let's say, the MITRE ATT&CK framework. We find out the TTPs, and we define a threat hunting team. After that, we look at our target. So let's say in terms of data sources, for this particular use case, we can look at, proxy logs, DNS logs, SMTP logs, mail logs, right? As well as NetFlow data. In terms of our arsenal, we are looking at things like SIEM dashboard, endpoint detection response console, Joe's sandbox for malware testing or analysis, dynamic analysis, or maybe, for example, things like even GCHQ, CyberChef, right? Sometimes becomes very useful. It's also, open source, I would say free, at least, to use, and something very, very useful in, kind of handling some of the obfuscated data, what you can encounter. In the next phase, we talk about actual execution. So when we're talking about execution, we are talking about things like, we start with making a hypothesis. So attackers operating a C2 channel that uses a custom encryption, search for anomalous domains, user agent strings or URLs, right? And that's important. Look for odd protocol usage, right? So for example, let's say HTTP connection on port 80 with no or unusual metadata, just as an example, right? And once you gather all that data, just kind of sort it in a decreasing order, and that's where you start doing your frequency analysis. You do stacking, right? And maybe it can be done on DNS queries. It can be done on HTTP GET or POST, submissions to website. So all that can be done to identify anomalies. Remember, I talked about aberrations and anomalies detection. Check on network accounting information, right? Becomes very, very useful. Bytes in, bytes out. Session time, right? It becomes very useful in terms of, if you see some beckoning, regular traffic which is going out, that could possibly be indicating something suspicious, right? Indicators searching, right? So that's where your threat hunting comes very handy. Leveraging your, threat intelligence data, and then, of course, establishing known good and known bad examples to build your training set. Malware analysis of suspected processes will also be very useful once you get to really, let's say on a machine, you find out a particular suspicious process, you can possibly do a malware analysis. You can dump that executable and, you can analyze it further to identify what is really initiating this C2 connection. There are many other things like, as an example, things like HTML response sizes, geographical irregularities in terms of the connections being initiated, DNS request anomalies, process name analysis across the whole spectrum, right? There are multiple things that you can do. Command line analysis, top talkers, very simple things that we've been doing for over the years becomes quite useful in this kind of techniques. So this is just an example. So we walked through, all these things, these 5 phases, and hopefully you get some example in this short amount of time that we have today, and we use it for improvising it for future purposes. So we've pretty much, talked about some good insights, right? So how to design your threat hunting program through this session while being aware of the key challenges that you face. On this slide, I'm trying to kind of summarize my take on some 10 commandments for effective threat hunting, right? Like I said earlier, right? Gauge your cybersecurity maturity level, allocate the right resources, know your ground. Asset management is important. Vulnerability management, right, is also important to understand the vulnerability landscape. Risk register, right? Focus on your crown jewels. Understand the risks that you have. Mind the insider threat. I think insider threat, human element is also a theme in this year's conference. I think insider threat, I would say, is connected to it. So people are most important assets and most critical. And also, the insider threat element of it is also quite tricky. So you need to manage that angle. Ensure your network visibility, uncover your blind spots. I can't stress enough. Know your adversary. That's also very important. Leverage a robust framework. There's a lot of good work done by existing frameworks, so leverage those. Few other things mentioned. And I think the most important thing I would just leave you with is that integrate robustly with other threat detection strategies. Right? I don't think that threat hunting is the only thing you need to focus on. This is to augment your existing threat detection strategies. So use it in that manner, and of course, define metrics for the threat hunting program. So, we hope you got some good insights here, and we are talking about obviously some call to action. So I would like to highlight some call to action for those who would like to implement what you understood today, because I strongly believe failing to plan is planning to fail. So always it's good to kind of have a plan to execute, right? So I would say that next week, maybe you should understand and gauge the maturity of your organization with respect to threat hunting. In the first 3 months, recognize those critical assets, processes, business processes, right? Systems of your organization with respect to the data and the systems that becomes critical out of that. Understand the organization's risk profile, threats, and from a threat perspective, understand the tactics, techniques, and procedures, the TTPs of the threat actors. Start gathering information from open source intelligence or commercial intelligence sources. That becomes quite critical to leverage what existing knowledge already is there, right? But I would still stress that while you look at indicators of compromise, you must also use an approach to kind of look at indicators of attacks, right? So that's how you kind of move the bar up to change the game, elevate the level of your game. Within the 6 months, I would say you should implement automation solutions to increase your visibility in the digital ecosystem. Well, this could be a stretched timeline, but I would say that just give or take. This is what I would recommend. You can have your own mileage there. Establish a telemetry baseline. Build your arsenal. I think keep building your tools and platforms that can help you do threat hunting effectively. And I would say, I think last but not the least, run sprints initially, right? The short runs, and eventually move towards running periodic and defined threat hunting campaigns, right? So I think that's how I would summarize my session. Thank you for your time today. Hope the session was useful and you enjoyed it. Please do ask questions in the Slido and a platform. I would be there to kind of answer your questions, and also please share your feedback regarding the session. Your feedback is very valuable to myself. And if you have any questions or feedback, you may also get in touch with me on LinkedIn as well as Twitter. You can see the coordinates on the screen. Thanks again and stay safe. Cheers.